So we can say welcome to Interference Archive, even though we are not at the archive right now. Welcome. Thank you for joining this space virtually. Interference Archive is an archive of material produced by social movements around the world. We're located in Brooklyn, New York. We're run entirely by volunteers, and we're collectively organized and really supported by folks who believe in this work. If you want to learn more about what we do, I've put some links in the chat to read more about our work, stay in touch with other events that we're doing in person and online. And we're open to the public several days a week for folks to just come in and look through material in the archive. So if you are in New York or planning to come to New York, we really hope that you will stop by. We also, when sharing our space with folks for events, do like to just share a set of community expectations. And even though we are not physically together today, I just wanted to share these expectations because we still have them for this virtual space. We ask that everyone who shares space with us is mindful of and takes responsibility for their speech and behavior. This includes acting out of respect and concern for the free expression of others, actively listening to others and not dominating discussions, respecting physical and emotional boundaries, and humbly accepting correction or correcting yourself, keeping in mind that the impact of your words and actions on other people is more important than your intent. So again, we're so thrilled to have you all here with us today in this space and to be working with Catalyst Press for this event. So I'm going to turn things over now to Ashanta from Catalyst.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashanta Jackson. I work in publicity for Catalyst Press, and we're an independent publishing company with a primary focus on books by African authors and those about Africa. We've been around since 2017, and we hope everyone check out all of our books after this event. But today we're really excited to bring two really talented people who are responsible for this amazing book that I got to hold in my hands. I was just being really excited about it earlier. So this is All Rise, Resistance and Rebellion in South Africa, 1910 to 1948. And we're really pleased to be joined by the author, Rich Conyngham, and one of the book's illustrators, Tumi Mamabolo. And they'll be talking a little bit about archives and what role archives played in creating this book. I'm going to pass them along to Rich so he can talk a little bit about the themes of the book and read a little bit from the intro. So, Rich.
Thanks, Ashanta. Hi, everybody. I'm Rich Conyngham. Yes, I'm the author of All Rise, and I'm very glad to be here today. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Interference Archive, for having us. Thank you, Catalyst Press, our publisher, for helping to organize this event. Thanks to Tumi, who will be chatting in a minute, for joining us too, one of my collaborators. I thought it just to sort of set the scene. I'm sure most people watching don't have much context about the book that we've created. It is a graphic history about resistance stories that took place in South Africa, Tumi and my country, between the years 1910 and 1948. Just to set the scene, I'm going to read the introduction to the book. It's obviously a visual book. The introduction is one of the few bits which are words only. Well, not entirely. There is one image which I'll share just to help give you all, I hope everyone can see that, an idea of what I'm reading about. So here I go. A dusty basement. Imagine a room full of forgotten stories which few readers know about. The room is not a library. The stories are not in books. To find this place, you need to travel to the basement of an old court building in the city of Bloemfontein, South Africa. It is there, beyond a heavy iron door, at the end of a passage lined with broken antique furniture, that the stories in this book were found. Before South Africa's constitutional court opened its doors to a newly democratic nation in 1995, the Appellate Division, which today is known as the Supreme Court of Appeal, was the highest court in the land. It was established in June 1910, days after the country's two dominant colonizing forces, the British and the Dutch-speaking Boers, had come together for the first time to govern one unified nation. Today, in the Supreme Court of Appeal's basement archive, there are thousands of cardboard boxes containing more than a century of case records. when you flick the light switch and the room's fluorescent tubes putter to life, row upon row of shelved rectangular sleeves are revealed. They sit like an audience waiting for a procession of readers to enter the room, but very few do. Occasionally, a judge or law clerk, sometimes a researcher, but more often than not, the archive goes for weeks without a visitor, patiently gathering dust. The oldest cardboard boxes crack like bones when you loosen them. Inside, yellowed pages are bound with string and rusty staples. Words flow in typewriter fonts or the elaborate, heavy inked handwriting of an earlier time. In letters, petitions, affidavits, transcripts, exhibits of evidence, and judgments, these words tell the stories of disputes won and lost. In one sleeve, it is a wife against a husband. In the next, a worker against a boss. One shelf up, a victim against a perpetrator. Further along, a citizen against the government. When you carefully consider these case records, what gave rise to them, who was involved, and ultimately how they were decided, not only are you looking back in time, but also accessing a history beyond the court itself. The disputes that reach the highest court of any country are a reflection of its society. They expose its fault lines and points of friction. Cases of resistance against authority are arguably the most illuminating, as they point to the struggles that motivated ordinary citizens to break the law or to turn to it in the pursuit of justice. All Rise is the product of years of research that began in the dusty basement of the Supreme Court of Appeal. It is a collection of illustrated stories of resistance and rebellion from the period loosely known as the Union years, between South Africa's unification in 1910 and the beginning of apartheid in 1948. This was a time of momentous upheaval in our country. Corporations and government bodies joined forces to attack the freedoms of working people. Passive resistors, strikers, rebels, and revolutionaries fought back in the streets and in the courts. Books have been written about these events, but many are now out of print, and most, if not all, have limited readership. Few foreground the anonymous men and women who took to the streets in protest. This is partly because working class people left little written history of their own, but also because historians and their readers have generally overlooked their lives and contributions. The basement archive of the former Appellate Division offers a unique opportunity to connect with these lost resistors and the faded worlds they inhabited. We, the author and illustrators, have chosen to revive these stories in the graphic form, rather than as a conventional written history. Our aim in doing so was to invite unlikely readers to open this book and once inside feel included by it. We hope to have done its characters justice and that through our illustrations and words, they will rise again, this time to receive the recognition they deserve from a wide, diverse readership. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. So one of the questions, just to get us started, it feels like maybe for US readers, the period of apartheid is one that here in the US we're probably more familiar with. Can you talk a little bit about why this era was so appealing for putting together this collection?
Sure. Well, apartheid is a great drama saga in our political history, which is extremely important in understanding the South Africa we know today. But for me, as written history, it's abundantly available in bookstores, in libraries, for anyone who's interested. As a result, partly the period that preceded it, not just the Union years, which All Rise covers, but the colonial period before that, dating even back before the Dutch arrived, has been eclipsed in a way that is troubling, because it was no less significant in terms of shaping South African society as we know it today. And at high school in the 90s, I studied this period. I chose history and I studied this period. And I remember it being incredibly dry, sort of election results, facts and figures, some black and white photographs of white statesmen. And then much later, when I discovered these stories in the Supreme Court of Appeal archive, I realized just how explosive and colorful and meaningful and prescient the period really was. There were events happening in the background of what I was reading in those textbooks in the 90s that did not feature at all. So of course, an equivalent volume could be done for the apartheid era, and I would be very interested in doing that. But this book goes out of its way to foreground the everyday people who stepped into the front line of working class struggles and achieved incredible things through their legal battles. And those victories and losses, we still feel them today. And they can be read between the lines in our constitution. So I guess it was the short answer was really that I wanted to bring, sort of push into the mainstream a neglected period.
I mean, it's interesting too that you mentioned that it's prescient, because it definitely gives a sense that history isn't just this one thing that happened, but rather lots of things that happened and continue to happen, and it's all on a continuum. So reading this, I really got a sense that these were really movements and people who kind of pushed a lot of things forward. You can see kind of parallels in later struggles, both in South Africa and here in the US. I was seeing so many interesting parallels. I wonder too, what made you decide to go with an illustrated volume rather than doing it kind of in an accessible written context, as opposed to that?
A great question, and that's a very important question, because I suppose, just following on from what I was just saying about apartheid sort of dominating our popular consciousness in South Africa, and also internationally when people think about South African history, I think our history is sort of, and I think this goes for many countries around the world, our written history is dominated by iconic figures. They're mostly men, and they can be heroes and villains. And certainly in South Africa, if you go to the history section of a good bookstore, very few of those books will be about sort of unknown, lost people. So I wanted to, yes, on the one hand, I wanted to foreground those lost people, but on the other hand, I didn't just want this book to be read by a handful of academics, by maybe some sort of intrepid students or activists who see relevance in their work. I wanted this to be in particular for high school South African learners. And beyond that, the more readers, the better, of course. But it was very, very important that young people in South Africa felt included by these stories. Because I think one of the dangers of placing so much emphasis on so-called great figures, as great as they obviously were, is that it creates the sense that we as everyday people can't play any role in molding our country's future. But these stories really show that. They show how through the law, it is possible, even as a very disadvantaged, very unlikely person in the kind of social and political circumstances, you can make a difference. And so I wanted to use the power of the artist's skills and talents to reach people of a younger age group, but also people that perhaps would not normally think to go into a bookstore and go to the history section.
Absolutely. So this seems like a great segue to Tumi. How did Rich approach you with this idea? Like, will you illustrate some things I found in a dusty basement? How did he bring that idea to you?
So funny enough, I was actually the one that approached him. I'd heard that he was looking for like an illustrator for chapter 5, or like for actually, the book in general. And I was just very much intrigued and drawn to the concept of what he's doing, the whole concept he spoke of earlier of this is a whole period of history that doesn't really get much attention. And the little bit we do know is just, I don't know, it's kind of like I'm overshadowed by those like apartheid years and like, the resistance like icons like Mandela and them. And this like telling of these stories and like, it being so accessible and so new and different, I think is what's, it really excited me. So like I approached him and he gave chapter 5 to me, which was I think I recall the trickiest chapter to get rolling. So yeah, it was like a unique challenge, but yeah, that's that's
Can you talk a little bit about chapter 5? This is for both. What made it a difficult one?
Okay, sure. Let me start, Tumi, and then you can fill in. I'm sure I'll need some gaps. Basically, it's probably or arguably the most obscure of all the stories in the book. One of the reasons why it was tricky, it's also quite a complex story. We didn't have that many sources, and we'll get into that later, how we got around that problem. But South Africa has what is self-defined as a nation within it, the Bafokeng nation, which and to sort of help understand this concept, it's a kingdom. It's a community that has a king, and it has a council. And this community has been in a valley sort of north west of Johannesburg for in that place for at least sort of 200, 300 years. We rely on oral history to know for how long it's been there. And in the 1920s, the reigning king was accused by his counselors of essentially corruption, of sort of embezzling community money for his own benefits. And they decided to remove him by vote. And South Africa in the 1920s was undergoing a process that would end up sort of setting up what became apartheid. Government was sort of was bit by bit sort of placing shackles over the working class people, particularly people of color. And this is a Black community in a rural area. And the councillors were basically saying, we want a democracy in this community. We don't want the oldest son of the reigning king to be the next king, because at that particular time they were having a lot of difficulties with their leader. And they decided to remove him, but then he was very, very strongly backed by the white government, who were trying to control the people. And the story basically shows the ways in which the white government manipulated the law and government policy in order to keep the king in place in a way that was which is ironic, because they said that rural Black people were not civilized enough to have their own democracy, and yet they were calling for it. So it says a lot about the intense racism of the time, but also says a lot about how the administration worked to keep things the way it was. And people who know anything about apartheid will definitely be able to see it in this story.
Yeah, I think like Rich there, you provided a really good backdrop to the writing aspect and the archiving process that you had to go through. From a visual standpoint, which is where I came in, the archives, being as sparse as they were, it was a bit challenging to, create those scenes and those characters and try to still remain faithful to the true stories that it's all based on. So yeah, having to take a lot of creative license, but make sure that it's remains truthful, remains authentic, it remains faithful to the story and the time that we were working with. And then, yeah, I think that was the main challenge for me, for everything just to look authentic and feel authentic.
So you mentioned the lack of material archives for some of these stories, and particularly this one. So from both of you, I'd love to hear a bit about how, what actual archival materials you used for your chapter, and how you use those. I think, we can all understand how one uses archives for creating a written narrative. But to me, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how you use those archives to create a visual narrative as well.
Sure. Rich, I think maybe you can even bring up that screen that we spoke about earlier.
Sure. This one, Tumi, or the next one?
The one with August, Chief August.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so I'm going to use that bottom right image basically to explain the process that went into interpreting the archives and creating something new out of them. That was a picture of Chief August in his younger days. And the story takes place in when he's like in his 50s. So this was the only image we essentially had of him, and I had to reinterpret, what he would, interpret what he would look like in the later years. And that was pretty much the process I followed with a lot of the images, the few images we had, was expanding on it, imagining myself in that situation, and along with some other collateral references from the time, around the time, not directly related to the time, synthesizing this, these new scenes and these characters in a way that's more authentic. So I'd say that was my process essentially.
And Rich, can you talk a little bit about how you made use of the archives and what physical materials you had?
Sure. The most fascinating source that we had for this chapter was actually correspondence between different levels of government, the white government, where you can really see what was sort of the background workings of the system. Them sort of discussing ways in which to suppress this kind of uprising by the rebel councillors, and admitting sort of in confidence, because these were not at the time public documents, that they didn't really know what to do. So without those documents, it would have been extremely difficult to piece the story together. Visually, Tumi had the biggest challenge of all the artists. Well, next to chapter 4, The Widow of Marabastat, which Dada Kanyisa illustrated, almost none. I mean, we're very lucky to have this image of August. The one to the left of him is not actually an image from that time in the Bafokeng. It's just the closest we could get. So we had to use a bit of creative license, but we were very, very meticulous about making sure, for instance, that cow was the kind of cow that would have been in that area at the time. Things like that. But the sources that we had available, that I had available for each chapter, really influenced the way that we ended up telling the story. Because we had such an abundance of government correspondence for this one, we were able to place emphasis on these conversations that were happening. And in this chapter, we actually used something like, it's almost entirely dialogue, which was deliberate, because we were able to draw on these sources, paraphrase them slightly, sometimes quote them directly, and piece together a narrative that way.
So just to explain, in case the people in the audience don't know, the reason why we're talking so extensively about chapter 5 is because we have Tumi here, but each of these chapters is illustrated by a different South African artist. So I'm wondering, Rich, if you could talk a little bit about, was it the availability of archives that made you choose these 6 particular stories, or were these stories that you were just really longing to tell? Can you just talk a little bit about how you chose these 6 stories?
Sure. I mean, there are possibly millions of great stories in South Africa's archives, like most countries' archives, that are waiting to be told. So you have to have some kind of guiding principle. And mine was, there had to be, the starting point was the Supreme Court of Appeal archive. And between 1910 and 1948 in that archive, there were hundreds and hundreds of cardboard sleeves with cases inside them. As I said in the introduction, they weren't all resistance cases. Sometimes they were divorce cases. So I went through all of those boxes and I pulled out the resistance ones. Actually, the final chapter is an exception, but that's because it's about Black mine workers from the 1940s. And it just so happened that because of their occupational situation, and the complexities around that. There were cases, but none of them ended up in the Supreme Court of Appeal where the miners were the litigants. They were all the litigants instead were sort of normally white trade unionists or sympathizers. And we wanted to tell a story that directly connected with the everyday lives of the mine workers. So for that reason, the lack of material in the archive led us into another archive where we could piece together fragments of their history. But yeah, it's really because reading those court papers can be so dry, they can be pompous, they can be technical, and yet these stories were so colorful, and it was clear to me while reading the materials that they lent themselves to the visual medium. And South Africa, for those who know it, is a very diverse country, and our history is complex and diverse. And many people may be surprised to know that some of the stories in here are about white resistors. And there were some very, very important stories that had never been told, or if they had been told, they were only in sort of PhDs. And so I wanted obviously accepting that I could never give a complete picture of the period of resistance during that period, to pick a combination that made sense, that was sort of representative of the movement at the time and the main sort of political, social resistance forces that were swirling around the country during those 38 years.
One thing I found really interesting reading too is that so many of these cases seem to fall under like kind of a very general umbrella of labor history. Was that kind of something you were working toward, or is that kind of just how things came together? Like you realized, wait, these are really powerful stories about labor movements.
I think it's not a coincidence, because the union years can be described as the kind of adolescent period of South Africa's statehood. And in other words, the white government at the time, it became a British-led government in 1900 after the Anglo-Boer War, and then in 1910, the reason it's called the Union is because the Dutch, or who later became the Afrikaans, and British joined forces in the government. So the prime minister and the ministers were a mix of the two. They were all white, they were all men, but they were either Dutch or British. They had many differences, but they had one shared mission, and that was to establish South Africa on the international stage. And in order to do that, they had to exploit natural resources rapidly in a coordinated way. And in order to do that effectively, they had to do it on the backs of the working class, of all races, but particularly people of color. And that's why, as a direct result, the cases that ended up in the Supreme Court of Appeal at that time were often connected to labor, and the resistance was representative of that attempt by the government. It was in reaction to that attempt by the government to establish South Africa sort of socioeconomically.
So a question about kind of the technical aspects of putting the book together. So Rich, you worked with all of the illustrators, but Tumi, did any of the illustrators like kind of work together at all in terms of sharing ideas or sharing, kind of structure, story structure, anything like that?
I'm not sure about the other illustrators, but I know that I was among, if not the last illustrator to jump onto the project. So by that point, all the other chapters had been completed already. And, I was kind of in that collaborative space with Richard alone. So yeah, I didn't really cross-pollinate with any of the other artists on this. It was just more of a two-person interaction.
Were you familiar with any of the other artists before you?
Yeah, I know one of them personally, Mark, who worked on chapter 6. We actually went to the same university, and we had interacted on various occasions before. So yeah, but I also know Liz Clark's work, not her personally, and she's someone that I've always admired So it was pretty cool to be working in the same space as all these like established like illustrators and artists. So yeah.
I'd love to learn a little bit more about kind of, because these are all South African visual artists in this book, I'd love to learn a little bit more about what the comic scene in South Africa, is it a really strong, growing scene? Is there a lot of community collaboration? Is there a lot of community just in general?
I would be remiss, I think, to answer that too accurately. The comic scene is something that I think has been more alive in, like the Western side of things, like America and like Europe. Recently, it is getting quite a revival in South Africa. There are quite a lot of like up and coming comics and artists and studios where they work in comics, but it's a slow kind of journey there, but one with like a lot of potential. I haven't really worked too deeply within that like industry apart from this graphic novel. So it's still like a space I want to tap into and to learn more about and to collaborate more in. Yeah, I don't know, Rich, if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Shanta, it was difficult to find artists for this particular medium. I was naturally inclined to look for sort of more realist styles rather than kind of more comicsy, cartoony styles. And it was difficult to find those people. In fact, about half of the artists actually had no direct experience in working in the sort of graphic history form, if you want to call it that, or graphic novel. Tumi, for instance, has been drawing since he was very, very young, and learning as he went. And I mean, Tumi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, it came through very strongly for me, Tumi's natural ability to lay out a scene. So I would write the script and hand it over to Tumi, and Tumi would visualize it in a very beautiful, very logical way, in a way that I could never have thought of myself. And that was one of like his strong abilities, which I think came from his own personal exploration of the medium. Others, Darek and Yisa and Mark Modimola, they are really sort of fine artists, and it was sort of like a departure for them into this medium for the project. So yeah, I would say that the scene is growing, as Tumi says. It's quite exciting. I mean, Jakarta Media is our publisher in South Africa. And 2 or 3 times already since the book came out, I've been contacted through them by other authors who are working on books that they want to be graphic, and they're asking for advice about, artists to contact and how to go about it, which I think is very, very exciting. There'll be more and more. I think we are fortunate. It's a long overdue rise in the medium, I think, but we're fortunate to be living through it right now. So hopefully it only goes from strength to strength.
Yeah, I know from Catalyst's perspective, we're absolutely hoping that it keeps growing and growing. So one of the things you mentioned, Rich, was about kind of gaps in the archives and kind of things that you had to construct kind of to fill in those gaps. I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that, but also I would love to know more about, as you were kind of going through all these materials and trying to construct these stories and fill in the spaces, what did you discover that was surprising to you? This is something you've been researching for a long time, but there had to still be a sense of discovery for you as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think, it might be instructive for me to just describe 2 of the other stories in the book very quickly, because they illustrate, on the one hand, like having an abundance, almost too much information to work with, and the other having almost none. Chapter 3, illustrated by Liz Clark, is called Come Gallows Grim. It is about, it's about the Rand Revolt of 1922, which was an armed uprising by white mine workers in the Johannesburg area against their employers and the government simultaneously. And they had, for a few days, Johannesburg was sort of under siege by these workers. They managed to take certain parts of it into their control, And a lot happened in a short period of time, but it was ultimately crushed by a military intervention. During those days, many people were mortally wounded, and a greengrocer was executed, and one of the workers was accused of the crime. And the story is about that case that ensued. Because it was a very dramatic episode in South African history, and it was led by white men. As a result, the archives have literally hundreds of thousands of legal documents related to what happened. I had so many pages to work with to read through for this story, that the challenge for me was actually knowing what to include and what not to include. And this is just a little reference to the earlier question about the cross-pollination between artists. I think to some extent it happened sort of through me, because like Tumi said, he was the last artist, but from each one to the next, I learned things, and that would come out in the collaboration process. And the artists were very, very good at sort of interrogating the need for words from me. I'm all for the sparsest possible language, letting the artwork hold the limelight. But sometimes when you find something so rare, sort of precious historical details that can only be communicated in words, it's difficult to know whether it's included or not. And almost want to show it off, because it's like, wow, no one's ever brought this into a book before. So that was the challenge for that one. By contrast, chapter 4, The Widow of Marabastad, which Dada Kanyisa illustrated, for that, we had something like 109 words. Okay, and here it's the opposite end of the spectrum. This is a story about a Black woman living in a township in what today is known as Tshwane or Pretoria. And it was, she decided one night in response to new legislation which banned Black women from walking around white neighborhoods after 10 p.m. She decided to stand outside the central police station in the city, get arrested, initiate a court case, and challenge the legislation that way. She was given a few minutes to speak in court. In that time, she said 109 words, and that's all that Dada and I had to go with. So it's a very intimidating place to be as a creative, and yet I absolutely believe it's possible. It's been done better than we did it. I have some books next to me right now that have been an inspiration to me, which are about this sort of slavery period, centuries before our period in Brazil and the United States. And in those books, illustrators and authors have, in my opinion, very effectively told a reliable, even rigorous story based on almost no materials. How you do that, it depends on the story. In our case, what we tried to do was, we were very lucky to have had a famous memoir called Down Second Avenue by Eskia Mpatlele, a famous South African author, who happened to grow up in that township where our protagonist, Helen Todi, was living in the 1920s. Very lucky. But it's an unconventional, for our purposes anyway, it was an unconventional source, a memoir. And what we did was we actually, we used scenes from the memoir in the story, reimagined by Dada visually, in order to sort of create a sense of the social milieu. We didn't take leaps of faith there. We were relying on a primary source. And you have to sort of think a little bit out the box in those situations. You have to look at paintings from the period and bit by bit piece together the details. But I think there is always a way to fill the gaps in a way that sort of remains faithful. It may become a bit more high level and then get into the detail again later. But for me, it was very, very important for this book to sort of to have detail which we could defend. I didn't want to make any creative decisions that we couldn't back up. So every single frame is based on some careful decision making. That I can say for sure. And I hope that readers who are not really interested in historical detail will still be able to enjoy the story, but maybe a historian who knows a lot about the period can be like, all right, they even got the clothing correct and the style of the buildings, because that's what we were aiming for at the same time.
As a historian and an archivist, I wonder, I mean, it's incredible that you were able to find and make use of these archives. What are your feelings about how we're preserving archives today? Like, it feels that there's so much information, but also preserving it seems to be more the difficulty. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what we can do about kind of preserving history in real time, so that a book like this could be possible about our era, you know, in the future. Right.
I mean, I think digitizing obviously is a huge part of this process. I live in Mexico City. I go to South Africa if I'm lucky for a few weeks a year, and I would love to do more books like this in the future. And in thinking about that, it's just a mammoth challenge to get the sources from afar. It's virtually impossible to not spend a month going to certain archives every single day. And when I'm there taking photographs with my phone or a digital camera, and then, you know, turn them into a PDF somewhere, I'm sure in the United States things are further, more developed. But I wish there was more, in my experience, I wish there was more funding and more care going into the way that we preserve, even for instance, our newspapers. There are some wonderful sources in South Africa's National Library, which are almost never used, and they have not been well preserved. And in a way, they sort of deteriorated. There were parts where, you know, pages weren't visible. I don't think it would take all that much money and all that much effort for us to, you know, to organize a system where all of this information is digitized, and it's easy to search for keywords, for instance, and you don't have to go through absolutely every single page in case you might miss a small article which relates to your story. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think perseverance was a major part of this, of what got us to the finish line with this book. And unfortunately, as wonderful as the archival sources were from a storyteller's perspective, it wasn't, it didn't make it easy for us, the kind of sources we had available.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I also think it leads to my next question, and I think that can lead to opening up the Q&A. So what would you advise for someone who is trying to undertake a project like this, trying to use what available archival resources there are to kind of construct an accessible history, or even trying to do an illustrated history like this? Where do you start?
I suppose I would say that there's a very strong temptation, and this goes right through the world of books. It comes from the publishers, it comes from the bookstores, to focus on lives, events that we know sell, that we know attract a certain kind of audience. In South Africa, we've already mentioned, Tumi mentioned Nelson Mandela. Mohandas Gandhi lived in South Africa for about 20 years, at the beginning of the last century. A lot of books have been written about those two men. Not to say that we don't need any books, of course we do, but there's so many spin-offs because they're commercially viable. I would say to people, like, be a bit more intrepid. I think you'll find even more exciting stories that have never been told before. It's possible to find them. The legal documents is one avenue you can take, but you can dig through PhDs, which are not famous for being fun to read, but they're incredibly valuable as sources for people like us who want to do this visually to start somewhere. I just wish academia in particular, but you know, the writers of history, of other forms of nonfiction, and even novelists would be more inclined to do their work visually. Not to say that the text-only form is not important. I just wish it was sort of done in equal measure, because I think we would expand the audience, we would diversify the audience, and we would and at the same time look for material that hasn't already been covered. I hope that our book will inspire at least a few people to pursue projects along those lines.